Start again. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وآله وأصحابه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum, dear brothers and sisters from our local community. This is one of our series of sessions called Speakers Corners that we're bringing to you during the month of Ramadan, where we introduce you to people who have interesting topics and thoughts that they'd like to share with you. And today it's our pleasure to welcome Dr. Osama Al-Azami to talk about the topic of Islam and modernity, reading Revelation in a secular age. Dr. Osama Al-Azami, he studied for his PhD in Princeton University and his MA, having studied Arabic and Islamic studies at Oxford. In addition to that, he's studying to become a mufti with the Al-Salam Institute under Sheikh Muhammad Akram al-Nadwi. Many of us will know of him. And he's also now he's also the author of a forthcoming book entitled Islam and the Arab Revolutions, the ulama between democracy and autocracy. And in addition to his academic writings, he's often requested to commentate on public affairs in the Middle East in the media, such as the Middle East Eye and MuslimMatters.org. So without further ado, it's a pleasure to welcome Dr. Osama Al-Azami to introduce us to this topic. We've got about 40 minutes or so to hear from you, Osama, and then we'll take some questions on this subject. Jazakallah khair. Over to you.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلي وأسلم على من بعث رحمة للعالمين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Apologies for the late start. I have been having a bit of technical difficulties. I'm going to actually try and see. I'm actually calling from my phone, and so I'm going to try and see if I can experiment with doing a presentation using my phone. I've never done this on Zoom, but it looks like I may have some possibility of doing this. So if you just bear with me for a second, it looks like I have very limited access to presentation opportunities. So I'm going to, inshallah, just speak using sort of the slides that I had. But
Osama, do you want to send me the slides? I might be able to put them up, or somebody else. Or
I can try
Ahmed.
that.
Yeah.
I can try that. The only concern I have about doing that is I'm going to have to ask for your email address sort of on the air, and that might not be an ideal sort of scenario.
Or you can send it to Ahmed, on the email that you've got.
Okay, that's probably so. If you just give me one moment, I'm going to do that now. Okay. I'm going to send a copy. If it's all right, I'm going to send you a copy on WhatsApp. That's right, and then hopefully you'll be able to forward that to Brother Ahmed. That's the easiest way.
That's fine. But in the meantime, you carry on speaking.
All right. So I've sent that now. No, now I'm actually sort of someone who works on Islam and contemporary sort of politics, as it were. And let me just get back to Alhamdulillah. If you just give me one moment, I can't actually see anyone on the screen. Okay, now. So I teach at the University of Oxford, and I also am someone who teaches at the Al-Salam Institute, which was mentioned earlier. It sounds great that a number of the attendees have familiarity with Al-Salam, and Sheikh Akram, who's one of my dear teachers, Hafidhahullah. And basically, my academic work overlaps a good deal with my Islamic studies work, and my sort of core area of interest is Islam and modernity. And so today's presentation is straight sort of like falls within that category. And there's so much to discuss on this area. Just on the realm of Islam and contemporary politics, I've just written a book. It should be coming out in August. It's took me a couple of years to write, and it's about 400 pages or so. And that's just Islam and politics and the engagements of the ulama. So if we're going to look at Islam and modernity as a whole, dozens of books have been written on this topic and continue to be written. But I'm particularly interested in talking about something which might seem a little conceptual. It might be a little heavy at this end of the day when we're basically a little tired from our fasting. So I'm going to try and make it as accessible as possible, inshallah. And I'm moving on to the second slide once, inshallah, Brother Matteo is able to put the slides up. You'll be able to see it. And my second slide asks the question, what is Islam? What is modernity? And why are they important? So those are kind of, the two core components of this are what is Islam and what is modernity. And with respect to Islam, most of us, of course, have, got a rough idea of what Islam is, but we may not have had a situation where we've had to think about it conceptually. And if someone asks us, what is Islam? What do we say? And of course, we have an advantage in as much as my third slide, and I hope it's possible to sort of share these slides soon. But my third slide basically draws on the Hadith Jibril, or the sometimes translated as the Gabriel Hadith. And Barakallahu fikum, excellent. So if you can sort of start the presentation, and I'm going to, Brother Ahmed, if you could sort of move on to, so this is great. The first slide is what is Islam and what is modernity. The second slide that is up on the screen right now is basically the question of defining Islam. How do we define Islam? And a very common way in which ulama speak of, how we understand what Islam is to quote this hadith, which is in Bukhari and Muslim. But it's also a hadith which, if you are familiar with Imam an-Nawawi's 40 hadith, which everyone should be familiar with and everyone should, have read. It's, in a sense, 40 hadith which encapsulate the entirety of Islam. He notes this as the second hadith, if I recall correctly. And so this is a hadith of Umar ibn al-Khattab. I'm not going to read the Arabic, I'm going to translate. But it's the hadith where a person comes to the Prophet, he sits down in front of the Prophet, and they're in a gathering with the companions, and no one recognizes him. But despite the fact that no one recognizes him, Umar ibn al-Khattab says, he highlights the fact that he was wearing extremely brilliant white clothing and very dark hair, and no one recognized him, meaning like there's something unusual here, because this is a small, close-knit sort of Medinan society. If someone's traveled from a distance and arrived at Medina, they would be in quite a disheveled state. But so there's something unusual already, and we learn what the reason this was unusual by the end of the hadith, because the Prophet ﷺ says to Umar radiallahu anhu, do you know who was, who just came, who was asking these questions? And those questions we'll get to in a moment. And Umar radiallahu anhu appropriately replies, Allah wa rasuluhu a'lam, Allah and his messenger know best. And so the Prophet ﷺ says, فَإِنَّهُ جِبْرِيلٌ أَتَاكُمْ يُعَلِّمْكُمْ دِينَكُمْ, that it was Jibreel alayhi salam, he came essentially in the form of a human being to teach you your religion. So in a sense, this is a summation. This hadith summarizes what this deen is. And Jibreel alayhi salam asked three core questions, and then he asked kind of follow-up. And the core questions are, what is Islam, what is Emaan, what is Ihsan? And in a sense, these three are the things that sort of identify for us our religious tradition in a very encapsulated way. Islam is basically portrayed as being the 5 pillars. Islam is the practice of the deen. Iman is the belief in certain components. أن تؤمن بالله وملائكته وكتبه ورسله واليوم والقدر خيره وشره. And basically believing in Allah, His messengers, His books, the last day, and that qadr is it's good and it's bad, meaning what Allah has written, it's good and it's bad. This is already preordained in a sense by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then he asks what's ihsan, and the Prophet describes it as that you worship Allah as though you see Him. I'll just keep it at that, but in a sense that encapsulates in many respects what the average Muslim will understand from their religion. And and this is how also the ulama speak of this religion. So we have Islam, Iman, and Ihsan as being the encapsulation of this deen. If I can go to the next slide, please. There's this wonderful sort of image which I found online, and I've given credit on the sort of on the screen. And basically, you have someone has elaborated. Okay, what are these 3 components? And this is a common way of elaborating this. These 3 components subdivide into Islam, meaning the sort of ritual components, Iman, the belief components, and Ihsan, the here it's been described as esoteric dimension, but in a sense, Ihsan translates as excellence, and this is very often seen as developing into the ilm of tasawwuf, which is about purity of intention, developing closeness to Allah. Those a'mal al-qulub, sometimes it's described as the actions of the heart, intention, devotion, and sincerity. All of these sorts of components are also, as well as the outward practice, there has to be the inner practice, as it were. If we can go to the next slide. I wanted to just signal that we're living in a time, and my presentation is called Islam and Modernity, reading scripture in a secular age. We live in a famous philosopher, North American philosopher, Charles Taylor, has described as a secular age. He's written a book, maybe 15 years old now, about 800 pages long, called A Secular Age. And in a sense, in this context, he starts off his book by saying, we live in a time where 500 years ago, there was really no option. He's talking about sort of Western societies. There was really no other option but to believe in God. And 500 years later, around the year 2000, when he's writing, it's belief in God has become one option among many. And he sort of wants to trace the historical development of that shift. And he describes, as I say, the situation where the belief in God becomes an option for a lot of people as a secular age. Now, for Muslims, of course, it's very different, I think, to the secular context of the West, where belief in God isn't really an option. It's something that you have to do. It has salvific sort of significance, meaning your next life really depends on your sort of commitment to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if you are not a believer, that is a very serious sort of issue in the Islamic tradition. Now, as a consequence of that, the Islamic conception of these sorts of questions is very different. In the West, the average person, it's almost immaterial if they're Muslim, Christian, and Muslims who are living in the West, are liable to sort of pick up that worldview in a sense. But what I'm trying to suggest is, from the internal Islamic perspective, that's not something which we sort of see as a serious option, right? But at the same time, I've got a book on the screen, What is Islam by Shahab Ahmed, where what you can see is the sort of, in my estimation, and Shahab Ahmed has passed away now, but is a scholar at Harvard University, and a very learned, someone who displays a great deal of erudition in this book. It's a very big book as well. But I think this book, in some respects, reflects that Western influence that creates a situation where really it's just an option. What do I mean by that? On the cover of the book, it's called What is Islam? And his actually preferred title was The Importance of Being Islamic. But he wants to redefine what it means to say, something is Islamic. And he basically says, look at this coin from, I think, Mughal India, which has Jahangir, one of the major Mughal emperors, on the coin surface, and he's carrying a cup of wine. Okay, and many of the Mughals and indeed, many rulers in Islamic history were not terribly exemplary when it came to sort of these sorts of practices. They might have drunk alcohol, and the scholars would say that this is obviously a sin, but in the belief of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, committing a sin doesn't take you outside the fold of Iman. It makes you someone who is sinful, and you should ask forgiveness, etc. And that's extremely important, obviously. But it's not that you're not a Muslim. And they go into sort of certain details in Ilm al-Aqidah, where they say the only thing that makes a sin mukaffir, or something that takes someone out of the fold, is if someone basically no longer considers it a sin, but considers it to be halal. And there are other sort of it's very important to think about the conditions for doing takfir. This is something which the ulama, are exceedingly careful about engaging in. And it's actually what they describe as a hukm qada'i. It's a judicial judgment. It's not something that the average person has really got the right to engage in these sorts of judgments about people. But, in terms of judicial judgment, if someone has gone through a judicial procedure whereby it is demonstrated to them to the satisfaction of sort of the scholarly sort of experts that this, for example, drinking of alcohol is not part of Islam in a way that is, it's not legitimate to drink alcohol, then that would be considered to be something which, if that person still insists that no, it's perfectly legitimate to drink alcohol, they would no longer be considered Muslim according to Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. So these are quite serious in some respects. But what I'm saying is, one of the arguments that Shahab Ahmed makes in this book is drinking alcohol is perfectly Islamic. And this is one of the things I think which arises from our being in a secular age, where why should there be this distinction in the view of many people of having to adhere to a legal code, which is why can't we redefine these very fundamental questions and say, no, actually, if it's been a practice that has been recognized in Islamic history as being, people practicing it all the time, we don't need to take the legal definition of, its rejection, that wine is haram, to be something which has to define our understanding of what Islam is. And I personally think that this is very problematic. And I think this would be the view of all ulama who are, trained in the tradition, that these kinds of efforts to marginalize legal perspectives and, in a sense, centralize the legal norms of the West, in my estimation, are what create these kinds of, among very intelligent people, these kinds of new interpretations of what is Islam. And that's one of the reasons why I'm talking about Islam and modernity, that there are certain challenges that we should be very aware of and should be wary of in some respects, and think about, okay, what do we do to preserve our own deen, and what do we do to preserve our own sort of sense of self-confidence that actually, no, this is something that ought to be practiced and ought to be sort of normative. I'm going to ask you, Brother Ahmed, to switch to the next slide. I realize I've got a lot of slides to go, so I'm going to see if I can be a little quicker. And I'm going to, this is all writing. What is modernity? Now, I don't expect everyone to read it, but, certain things, let me highlight, certain things. So yes, there's technological advancement, and in the European context, as I've mentioned, the kind of loss of faith and gradual secularization. Secularization is defined in various ways. Some people sort of argue that this is a reflection of institutional differentiation between politics and religion, for example. And towards the end of this presentation, we're going to explore the concept of religion itself, because in a sense, the concept of religion is doing a lot of the work of marginalizing sort of religion in a secular age. The Islamic conception of religion is very different. Transformed conceptions of ethics, of gender, sex, and sexuality. And this is something that even at a school level now is being sort of, in some respects, enforced on Muslims. Democratization, rise of democratic states. The last one I want to kind of focus on, the superiority. Well, I want to highlight, among others, epistemic superiority of science, which means basically that, for something to be true, it has to be backed by science. This is kind of this conception of truth or falsehood that exists in the modern period. If I can go to the next slide, please. And I'm going to do this slide very quickly. In a sense, how did Europe come to this point? 1517, this guy on the right of the screen, a chap named Martin Luther, initiates a process known as the Reformation. But he basically kind of tries to contest the religious authority of the Catholic Church. And this sets off wars of religion in Europe that last about 150 years and causes the death of millions. And this is actually very often the way in which Europe sees its it was rescued in Europe's conception. Religion was divisive and it created a lot of misery and death and so on. And therefore, it was certainly a positive to leave religion from a European perspective, so to speak. If you can go to the next slide, please. And, I've kind of signaled already with respect to Islam, one of the challenges is that you have this rise of what I've called competing sources of normativity. Let me break that down. I'm an academic. I use terms that aren't always understood, and I'm happy for people to sort of like send in questions, written questions, or ask questions just to get some clarity on some of my language. So the source of normativity is basically the source from which we derive our norms, our sense of what is right and wrong. And in a sense, from the Islamic perspective, one of the, two of the most important sources for really deciding how we should behave in this world are the Quran and the Sunnah. And what's happened in the modern period is that these are now highly contested in a sense, those are just one set of guidance, sources of guidance for a lot of modern people. For modern people, it's like, okay, in the political realm, it's the democratic will that matters. In the realm of, personal and social practice, we have other sources of ethics, liberal values and these sorts of things, which, emphasize individual choice and equality of various kinds, between the sexes, for example, and a whole host of other areas in which, there are norms which run up against, in many respects, what a tradition like the Islamic tradition and the Quran and the Sunnah have brought, and are seen as enjoining for Muslims. And so I don't think I'm going to go into answering the question of what defines Islam's norms and what defines modernity's norms. I've kind of signaled some of this in what I've said already and what happens when they conflict. But in a sense, the entire presentation is thinking about, okay, what happens when these things conflict? And I want to switch gears now, actually, and think about, okay, well, where does the modern world get its conception of, I'm kind of switching now to the question of politics and religion specifically. So, where does the modern world get its conception of secularism as being the appropriate way of dealing with the challenges of modernity? And so if I can ask for the next slide, you have, this is a bit of a throwback to the 1930s, I believe, but someone wrote about something called Whig historiography. And let me just explain what Whig historiography is. This was basically a liberal tendency in the 19th and early 20th century to see that the world was heading towards, liberty and enlightenment. So in a sense, this is something which happens in all sort of major civilizations historically. When they are on top, they suddenly think, actually, this was supposed to happen all along. We were supposed to be on top all along, and everything up to this point has led to us. And it's a kind of very triumphalist reading of history. It reads history teleologically, which means that history is heading towards a goal, which is us. And it continues to this day. You have a person like Francis Fukuyama, who wrote a book called The End of History, written in the 90s, where he basically said, well, ultimately, history has ended up at the United States, and we are the pinnacle of history in a sense. And, this kind of is the narrative of secularism in many respects. If I can go to the next slide. I've already signaled this, but in a sense, secularism is saying that, look, this is something that needs to happen. We need to get past religion because religion causes sectarian violence and warfare. And therefore, secularism is necessary. Now, on the screen, I have this wonderful book called The Myth of Religious Violence, which I highly recommend, even though I have some disagreements with his conception of religion. But it's, and I hope to sort of engage this and potentially write a book called The Myth of Secularism, if Allah gives me tawfiq, inshallah. But in a sense, one of the things that Kavanaugh argues is that, the way in which modernity creates religious violence is an act of, imagination almost. So let me, just briefly ponder on this issue. What you have with secularism, with religious violence is, in modern times, certain types of violence are considered to be legitimate and others are considered to be illegitimate. So religion is created, in a sense, in a certain way in modern imagination. And religion is defined as being a matter of private belief. So if it's a matter of private belief, once it comes into the political realm, it is no longer, doing what it's supposed to be. It's bad religion, as it were. and therefore, the violence perpetrated by religion in the political realm is bad. The irony, of course, is that modern states are predicated on the legitimacy of their violence. And so what's happened really is that modern narratives create a sort of, they socially construct an imaginary, I'm using social scientific words, I'm going to try and avoid that, but they socially construct a concept, a conceptual universe, so to speak, where certain types of violence are legitimate and other types of violence are illegitimate. And the legitimate types of violence, namely violence in the name of the state, the violence that is perpetrated in the name of that doesn't register as being inappropriate violence. And so it doesn't sort of create a sense of outrage. So if we just look back at the 20th century, and let's look back at the last couple of decades, right? The Biden administration in the United States has just recently declared that we're going to end the war in Afghanistan. And the US has been at war in Afghanistan since 2001. It's a 20-year war. Tens of thousands of people have died, perhaps hundreds of thousands. After Afghanistan started, the war in Afghanistan started in 2001, of course, the Bush administration, for those who have long memories, the United States sort of went to war in Iraq, and they went to war on false pretenses. It was sort of with the support of the British government as well. And there are estimates of, direct casualties in the hundreds of thousands, potentially, and indirect casualties altogether being well over 1 million Iraqis dying. Now, if you look at the 20th century as well, of course, you had the two world wars, which collectively, in a very short span of time, because of modern technology, killed far more than the sort of wars of religion did over a period of 150 years. But we still think religious violence is bad. It's built into the narratives that we are told constantly. So the news that you'll get on a daily basis, the last year obviously has been coronavirus, but usually you'll get plenty of news of ISIS, and you'll get news of in a previous decade of Al-Qaeda and all sorts of violence, Al-Shabaab and so on. Everyone knows the names of these terrorist groups, so to speak. The irony, of course, is that at the same time, very often there are reports about fights against these sorts of groups, but there's no reflection in the daily narratives. I mean, in academic writing, there's plenty of reflection on these things, but where do these types of violence emerge from, right? The fact that the US effectively funded the Afghan sort of war in the 1980s, which gave rise to groups like Al-Qaeda, that the US sort of invading Iraq in 2003 created the circumstances that allowed for and justified the rise of ISIS in many, in their own internal discourse, but also it really created the conditions that allowed for that, which is why someone like the former president of the United States, Barack Obama himself, said, I think in 2015 or something like this, that ISIS is a consequence of the Iraq war, and it's a lesson in why when you go to war you should aim before you shoot. So when they themselves occasionally recognize these things, they don't really inform the narrative of what sort of violence is legitimate or illegitimate and so on. And of course, from the perspective of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, ISIS is illegitimate and Al-Qaeda is illegitimate. But at the same time, the wars that gave rise to these people are also illegitimate, right? And they're usually engaged in by American empire. So I've kind of gone off on a discussion on the way in which religious violence is constructed in the modern period. And I'll now sort of shift gears, if I can go to the next slide, as to the understanding of separation. I'm going to skip this slide. We've kind of discussed secularism as being the separation of religion and politics. But what I want to ask is, what about an Islamic perspective, or an Islamic reading of these sorts of questions? And increasingly, I think with more and more scholarly voices entering the academic space and starting to, in a sense, bring an alternative narrative to these questions, people often coming from an Islamic background or a Muslim background are able to begin that subversion of the discourse that really is the dominant discourse, which informs everything that we do in society. And so that's why these are actually very important things for us to reflect on. Is there an Islamic perspective on these sorts of questions, on the question of religion and politics and the separation of religion and politics? And this is an excellent book by Ubayma, Anjum, Politics, Law, and the Islamic and Community in Islamic Thought, and the subtitle is The Taymiyyah Moment. But Professor Omar Anjum in the United States, he basically says in the preface, the question isn't why Islam, separates, has not separated religion and politics. The question is actually why in Muslim societies religion and politics have been separated, because that really is an imposition of a secular, colonial secular sort of like reality. Islam had certain ways of engaging politics that were not authoritarian, totalitarian, and these sorts of problems that are very often associated with the European experience of a kind of church state paradigm because of the Catholic Church and so on. And there's a very distinctive history there. And this is something which also Michael Cook, a scholar with whom I studied in the United States, is a British scholar actually. He points out that in the Islamic tradition, from its earliest texts and the earliest norms that are derived from the practice of the Prophet and his khulafa, it's very clear that there's a political dimension to this religion. It's very obvious. So the fact that the Prophet ﷺ himself is the head of a state, and as soon as he passes away, yes, no one inherits his religious authority in the sense of being able to speak to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala directly. But the Khulafa, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali, continue to maintain the Khilafah. The state is transformed from a state of Nubuwwah to a state of Khilafah, but the state persists. And so, in a sense, we need to sort of rethink some of these questions. And I want to go to the next slide, if that's okay, and think about what is it? What is the definition of religion? When we look at these dictionaries, we should realize actually this kind of reflects what the word means in English, right? So in English, according to the Oxford Dictionary of English, the Oxford Dictionary of English is kind of a dictionary of current usage. According to the Oxford Dictionary of English, it is a belief, the belief in and worship of superhuman controlling power, especially of a personal god or gods, right? So it connects it with the belief in God. And Brent Nombury, author of a book I'm going to show you on the next slide, he basically says, actually, religion is anything that's in practice, religion is anything that sufficiently resembles Protestant Christianity, by which he means it's a privatized belief system, right? So if I can have the next slide, it's a bit fairer to give the full sort of like picture. He's not, he's saying that such a definition, saying that religion in the English language, or actually he argues that in modern languages generally, and I disagree with that, but religion refers to anything that resembles, sufficiently resembles modern Protestant Christianity, in that it's private and so on. He's saying all of these, this may seem a very Eurocentric understanding, it may be very simplistic, etc., but it actually reflects the way in which people understand the term religion. He's saying modern people, when the term religion is used, think of something which is a privatized belief. Now, I would disagree with that because plenty of Muslims, because of the nature of their own tradition, don't agree with that sort of understanding of things. So if I can go to the next slide, I'm going to actually, this is one of the things that I hope to do in the course of my career, but there's this great book by actually a Bengali scholar from Indian Bengal, so Dipesh Chakraborty, who basically is at the University of Chicago. And there's something of an irony that in order to try and subvert the dominant narratives, you have to be co-opted within the institutions that control the dominant narrative. So University of Chicago, I myself at a place like Oxford. But I think it's also, this is what needs to be done, because these are the dominant centers that purvey or that spread the narratives of, the conventional way of thinking about these things. So Dipesh Chakraborty, he wrote a book in the year 2000 called Provincializing Europe, where he basically argued that we need to think about transcending this Eurocentric conception of history that sees modernity as this kind of European product, and that everyone, in a sense, needs to reach, this kind of reality or this kind of way of being. They have to resemble Europe in order to be modern people. And what I want to suggest is, ultimately, there are reasons for Europe's rise. There's a lot of historical debate, but its technological advancement and the discovery of coal in a place like the United Kingdom, well, Britain at the time, these sorts of things are very often accidents of history. The fact that Europe became technologically advanced enough to militarily dominate the various Muslim countries is not an indication that their sort of concepts when it comes to ethics and morality are, better than the concepts of ethics and morality that Muslims have, for example. Those are two very different sort of areas of inquiry. And so I want to go to the next slide, and this is actually my penultimate slide. And I want to, think about what if we were to sort of take an Islamic definition of religion? What would that look like? And, scholars like Brent Nombre, who I mentioned, they basically argue pre-modern people didn't actually have a concept of religion, right? They sort of had all sorts of other concepts that organized their life, but the idea of religion is not something which is meaningful for them. I disagree with this because, just for the reason of this verse that we have on the screen where it says, "Lakum dinukum waliya din." The notion that there's something which is deen, which can be sort of used to designate both our deen, Islam, and the deen of the mushrikeen or non-Muslims, makes the sense of the term religion, very reasonably clear in the Islamic tradition from the very beginning. This is in the Quran, of course, and this was something which was revealed in the Meccan period. And this is reflected, of course, in the way in which the ulama think about and write about deen throughout Islamic history. So Ibn Taymiyyah, who's a scholar who comes a bit later on, 728 of the Hijri calendar, 1328 of the sort of Common Era calendar, he actually has a fascinating definition of religion where he basically says that deen doesn't even require belief in God. It's basically about a community that has a shared, that shares norms. And so with the final slide, I just want to think about, and this is something that I'm doing as an academic, but I also would encourage people to, think about this when very often they are affected by the views that are around them, and they think, oh, I have to somehow justify the Islamic perspective because it has to somehow justify itself with respect to the modern secular perspective, that secular perspective is the norm. And in order for me to be a participant in the modern world, I need to justify myself in relation to it. And what I want to do is, I want to suggest inverting the gaze. What I'm saying is inverting the gaze, looking at things somewhat differently. What if we take the Islamic understanding of religion, meaning a sort of, as I put it earlier, a community that shares norms that sort of like organizes their society in a particular way, and say, actually, secularism is a religion, right? I mean, from an Islamic perspective, secularism is a religion. So secularism's core claims suddenly become very incoherent. It's like the core claim of secularism is that it represents a separation of religion and politics, or religion and state, right? But if it itself is a religion, what it's really doing is using, and this is what I argue in hopefully a forthcoming paper, what it's doing is it's kind of pulling the wool over people's eyes, or engaged in a kind of sleight of hand. What's really going on very often is secularism is a set of assumptions and a worldview that is being used to define the way in which politics can be legitimate. Okay, and from an Islamic perspective, in a sense, that's their religious worldview. And by calling Islam a religion and calling itself, something distinctive from religion, it's able to say, well, religion should be in the private sphere, so you all need to keep your stuff in the private sphere, but we are going to define the sort of public sphere in secular terms. And there's a considerable amount of debate, for example, with respect to liberalism as a sort of ideology, in a sense, the ruling ideology of the West of the last half century, perhaps, though it's really under pressure under the current sort of period. That liberalism, there's a lot of discussion about liberalism being a comprehensive doctrine. This was the term that was used by some of these philosophers to say, religions are comprehensive doctrines, but liberalism can also be a comprehensive doctrine. And what I'm suggesting is, once they all start becoming religions, then they no longer have, or the equivalent of religion, they no longer have that, claim to say, actually, our politics is somehow purified of religion. And I am not altogether original in suggesting secularism or liberalism can be a religion. So, in the Western tradition, for example, Emile Durkheim, he's a famous, one of the founding fathers of sociology as a discipline. He famously defined religion not with respect to God, but with respect to a communal practice. And he calls the sort of group around which the community is established a church, but he's just using this as a technical term, as an institution. So I'm going to read this definition. A religion is a unified system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things. And then he explains sacred things are those things which are set apart and forbidden, so you can't transgress against them in a sense. So, which are beliefs and practices which unite one single moral community called a church, meaning this moral community, they have a shared moral sort of perspective on the world. They are unified by an institution, and that institution unites all the adherents to it. And people like there are modern Muslim scholars who basically said, well, the state effectively becomes something like that, unified institution which everyone has to adhere to, whose moral sort of paradigms everyone has to adhere to. So in a sense, according to some of these scholars, the state is kind of like a religious focus of, or religious qibla, you could say. I wanted to close it there. I mean, this has been interesting. Let me sort of just say that, this is, I hope, interesting food for thought, even in a time like Ramadan, that we are thinking about, okay, well, we live in times which are very unusual compared to, in a sense, what the Islamic tradition arrived into during the time of the Prophet ﷺ, in 7th century Arabia, and even the last 1400 years or so, until the modern period, until the last 200 years, when Europe really begins to impinge on Muslims in a big way, with the arrival of the colonialists in India in the 1700s, late mid 1700s, the arrival of Napoleon into Egypt in the sort of turn of the 18th century. So all of these sorts of things really bring this transformation. But what I want to suggest is they're bringing a worldview which is, a contingent product of their own history. And we have our own worldview as well, which can be in dialogue as an equal, inshallah, with these, without having to think, actually, we need to justify ourselves in some way with respect to them. Okay. And I don't think we do. I think we can sort of have a sense of pride in our own very rich tradition. Unfortunately, very often we're not informed of our tradition, which has this 1400 years of scholarship, which is really unequaled to my knowledge by anything that we have comparable from the European historical tradition. And there's excellent work that talks about this as well, in terms of just the scale on which knowledge was produced throughout history. Okay, Jazakumullah khairan. I hope this was interesting, somewhat, inshallah, beneficial. I apologize once again for the technical difficulties that I experienced towards the beginning of this, but I hope we can sort of. So I'm getting some questions, and I'm going to try to. Well, no questions yet. So I'm happy to sort of.
So, I mean, Jazakallah khair, Osama. Thank you for giving us that presentation. I know, speaking beforehand, this is like a drastically shortened version of a multi-part course that you've presented,
Right.
for, and you've done it really well in introducing this to us here at Al-Emaan. So I might just kick off with a question. I know there's one in the chat, but I'll take host prerogative.
Sure.
So talking about secularism and our experiences of it on a day-to-day basis, I guess the example that comes to mind most frequently is what's happening in France at the moment, where there seems to be some sort of fundamentalist secularist traits in the central government, which is impacting on the day-to-day lives of Muslims. And I was just wondering, from your reading of the situation, what is it that the scholars are saying about this, and how Muslims should be reacting to this reality of not being allowed to wear hijab, for example, at school for teenage girls, for example?
SubhanAllah, I mean, I've not actually sort of explored how the ulama are sort of suggesting people respond to this. This is nothing new, of course, in France. So, I've given a fairly, I hope, robust critique of kind of a secularist worldview as being thinking that only secularism is really acceptable. But I should add a qualification here, which is the form of secularism in France, often called laïcité, is quite different to the forms of secularism that exist in other parts of, say, for example, in the English-speaking world. And so, it's a far more aggressive form, as you described, a kind of fundamentalist. Some people call them secular fundamentalists, so to speak. Some scholars call them ideological secularists, whereas they would call others sort of moderate secularists and so on. So, it's how do we respond to this sort of situation? What you have is basically a kind of persecution of an ethnic minority. This flies in the face of liberal values, actually. But, the way in which liberalism as I mentioned, liberalism is in crisis. This is something which a lot of liberals talk about today, with things like laissez doing this. And of course, we had the Trump administration. Trump himself is, kind of a dictatorial kind of figure, and he tried effectively to overthrow the US government. But what I'd say is that the ulama in these sorts of questions have historically had two kinds of responses. One is, in some sense, accommodationist, that basically kind of surrendering to the state, and the other is to try to engage in an oppositional kind of manner. So there's actually an excellent sort of discussion of this in a book called Schooling Islam by a scholar called Malika Zeghal, where she discusses the two different paradigms or two different responses to Jacques Chirac. This is back in 2005, I think. His sort of attempt to try to, basically ban the hijab in schools. And the Sheikh Al-Azhar at the time, basically the French authorities went to the Sheikh Al-Azhar and said, can you give us a fatwa to justify this? And he said, and of course the Sheikh Al-Azhar is often something of a compromised, political figure. So his, and I think this fatwa more or less reflects that. Not all Sheikh Al-Azhars have behaved like this historically, but this of Sayyid al-Tantawi, he basically said, well, if the state says it, the state has the prerogative to lay down laws, and Muslims basically just have to accept that. It's unfortunate, but they just have to accept that this is what the state has said, and therefore we're going to be forced to take our headscarves off and so on. Yusuf al-Qaradawi, Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who's in many respects one of the greatest scholars of the 20th and 21st centuries, and also an Azhari himself, he presents a very different perspective. In that article, it's presented as he basically, speaking at the time, he was the president of the European Council for Fatwas and Research. He basically said that the French government should not be impinging on people's individual rights, and Muslims need to engage in all legitimate and legal mechanisms to try and oppose this. But ultimately, if they are being compelled to, there's very little option but to, there aren't enough, Islamic schools to be able to accommodate all Muslims and so on. So very often what they say is that, these are circumstances where people will, if they're compelled to, they recognize that this is something that they do not want to engage in, but they, if they are not allowed to wear in, I don't know in what setting, if it's all public settings or if it's I've not read enough. And so, in a sense, these are circumstances similar circumstances came about when the, during the Reconquista of Spain, when Spain was basically engaged in the Inquisition and the expelling of Muslims from those countries. They, forced Muslims to, for example, eat pork, and they forced Muslims to, I think, celebrate, mass and these sorts of things. And in a sense, we're having a kind of a modern version of those sorts of inquisitorial approaches to France. And what we need really is to have a combination of, very politically engaged Muslim communities, along with sort of people who are actively trying to develop arguments as to why this is completely legitimate. Sorry, I've gone on for a while. I hope that makes sense.
That's really informative. And you know, you're talking about Reconquista and what's happening, what happened there. I mean, arguably it's happening now in China en masse as well, where people are being forced in a lot worse situation.
And these are actually, in some respects, you know, some of this stuff is signaled in hadiths that there will come times that you know, this kind of persecution will befall Muslims. And so, you know, we also have to recognize that people living in these sorts of persecuted circumstances are excused for maybe not living up to, you know, some even basic Islamic norms. One other thing I'd mention actually is Shaykh Abdul Hakim Murad has this book called Traveling Home about Europe. I've written a review on it, but one of the things that I thought was, you know, it sort of mentions in a footnote that Abu Hanifa had the view that Muslims living in non-Muslim lands, it's described as lands of shirk, but you know, that could be extrapolated to non-Muslim lands in modern times. They are still considered Muslim even if they deny basics of their religion. And so, because very often, you know, unless they basically say, I'm no longer Muslim, as long as they affirm their religious identity, even if they deny the Sharia because of their ignorance of these sorts of things, it's suggested, Abu Hanifa argues that they can still be considered Muslims. So we really need to have this kind of charitable attitude towards our fellow Muslims in places like France, who may be really suffering and forced out of their own religious identity by the state.
Got a couple of comments in the chat. First, well, another one's just come up. The first one I think is around the definition that you put about Islam, and whether it's, we should really be calling it a way of life rather than a religion.
Right. It's a very good question.
Does that get over some of the issues that we have about the limiting?
Right. So that's one strategy. Let me see if I can switch the light on because they're becoming perfect. That's one of the strategies that you know, a number of scholars you know, in the Indian subcontinent and in the sort of and Shahab Ahmed also indicates this, that, you know, this is something which is very often stated, and it's kind of obvious because Islam is far more holistic than the way in which religion is conceived of in the modern West. This is what I'd say is that, you know, basically this is an alternative strategy to dealing with the same kind of issue, which is to say that you can say, I'm suggesting, why don't we redefine the conception of religion? Why do we give them, you know, basically sort of those who uphold a kind of secularist conception of religion, a monopoly on defining what a religion is? The term is something that we use as well, deen. Okay, you can basically say, actually, you know, what I'm suggesting is religion as defined by modern people is indeed that restrictive, private, personalized belief. And I'm saying, well, we can actually say that they have no right to say that that restrictive, privatized belief is a universal definition of religion. We have our own definition of religion, and we can then engage in a kind of inverting the gaze and say, okay, what happens when we study the West using our conceptions of religion, and then we realize, actually, the West is a deeply religious society, right? They have, you know, their entire sort of, and it's very, very integrated into liberal values, and secular values are deeply integrated into the legal systems of these countries, right? And, you know, I have to think about this more, but I'm thinking about, you know, they could be considered a kind of approximated to Ahl al-Kitab of a kind, right? So, you know, that would allow for people who maintain like liberal secular values to be, you know, to live as respected minorities within Muslim societies. This is what historically happened with Christians and Jews. And the Prophet ﷺ said about, you know, non-Ahl al-Kitab, people like the Majus, you know, these Zoroastrians and various other traditions, sunnu bihim sunnat Ahl al-Kitab, you know, غير ناكحي نسائهم وآكل ذبائحهم, that practice the sunnah of the Ahl al-Kitab with them without marrying their women and without eating their meat, right? So I'm not sure how strong that hadith is, but I know the first part is certainly, and that's why the ulama very often, you know, when they went to these new lands, and for example in India, some people actually said that Hindus can be considered in that sort of way a minority religion. There's Ahl al-Kitab of a sort,
right?
And I think this could be, it's an interesting sort of theoretical thing.
I think I might just go to perhaps the last question before we close up, because I can,
Sure.
I don't know about you, but I can start smelling the pakora.
Okay. I'm upstairs, the furthest room from the kitchen.
It's getting quite about an hour away from Islam.
Right.
I appreciate you've been talking for a long time. So,
Right.
so one of our listeners has asked a question about, well, can you not just simply practice your faith without being influenced by the secular world? Is that even possible?
So how I'm not entirely sure I understand the question. Let me just see if I can sort of, is this question the fifth question?
This last one.
In current times, we see different scholars taking different various approaches on dealing with political leaders, from those who will actively oppose them on policies to those who will work closely with them in the name of peace, along with those who choose. Okay, this is a different question. Okay, I mean, could you rephrase the question that you just asked?
The question is, I mean, how for those people who simply try to practice their faith without being influenced by the secular world, is that a practical aspiration?
I think so, in the sense, in as much as we don't really have a choice. I think, you know, if you want to be faithful in this, in I don't think it's a secular world. I mean, a secular age was used by Charles Taylor, but he, you know, very self-consciously says that this is really true only for North Atlantic societies, by which he means North America and Europe, Western Europe even. Like if you go to Eastern Europe, religion is actually extremely important. And, you know, they actually went to war based on religious identity questions in Bosnia and the sort of in Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia. Now, for people living in the West like ourselves, I mean, I think that, you know, we have to recognize that we live in, I think it's useful to think in terms of we live as religious minorities within, you know, another, what I would argue, religious framework. And sometimes that places constraints on our sort of way of how we would like to be able to conduct ourselves. But alhamdulillah, in a place like the UK, a lot of the time that's not the case. I mean, a part of the constraints that we experience are things like Islamophobia. And what, you know, part of what that does is it diminishes the confidence that Muslims have in their own sort of religious identity. I remember, I mean, after 9/11, and I just started university, and in 2004, I think, like someone on my course who's of a Muslim background, I think she would very self-consciously self-identify as Muslim, said something along the lines of, you know, she was just asking me, oh, is Islam a violent religion? And I was like, you know, how, you know, this is, I did my undergraduate at Oxford University, and I thought, you know, so very intelligent people of Muslim background in their late teens, early 20s are being so sort of like fundamentally challenged in their own self-image of what their religion is, that they're asking, you know, is this a violent religion? And, you know, that really, I think, is one of the challenges that we need to face up to. We need to give Muslims a sense of self-confidence, partly by the sort of deconstruction that I've been engaged in. But they need to recognize, actually, you know, not only is Islam not a violent religion in that sort of sense that is widely pervaded in the mass media, but in so many respects, in so many ways, we have a worldview that is so much more compelling and so much more persuasive than, you know, all of the secular ideologies, in my perspective, that are out there. And we have something to offer this society that will enrich this society. And we have to have the self-confidence to be able to develop those sorts of arguments in written form that people then can turn to us and say, you know, we have so much more to learn from you. What can we sort of, what do you have to offer us? But we have to do our work to be able to get there, inshallah. I hope that partially answers the question.
That really helps. So I unfortunately missed a lot of questions on the Q&A. So if you don't mind sticking around for a few more.
I don't mind at all. Yeah.
Okay. So I think one question in terms of secular approaches is around feminism that's often asked.
Sure.
And how does feminism? Straight question is, does feminism have any place in Islam?
Okay,
any views on that? And I think
sure.
one of the final questions I'd like to put to you, I think it's right up your street in terms of your experiences and your academic approach. The question is about scholars taking various approaches on dealing with political leaders,
right?
Who actively oppose on policies, and to those who work very closely with them in the name of peace.
Right.
Where do you see the balance and all of that?
Sure. So let me take the feminism question first. I mean, the thing is, as with any sort of complex tradition, you know, it's very difficult to just use a label and say, you know, is this equal to this or something like this? You really need to dig deep. Okay, what do you mean by feminism? Feminism is such a diverse tradition. If you go and read the academic literature, that it's very difficult to, you know, give sort of like a short answer to, okay, what is feminism? But ultimately, very often a common sort of refrain is feminism is a tradition that tries to realize equality for women. Now, there are various types of approaches to these sorts of questions, even in the West, right? These aren't monolithic. There isn't just one straight answer. And we can, reflect this in just, how the tradition of feminism has responded to modern debates, certain modern debates. There's an entire tradition of feminism which is deeply opposed to transgenderism, for example, which is one of the other modern issues. Because they think that threatens the integrity of feminine identity. If you can just switch over, that's a problem, so to speak. Now, what I'd say is that, I guess if you break down what different types of feminisms are, then you're going to be able to ask, okay, well, is this component of feminism something which is acceptable? Showing respect to women, for example, or giving women agency. I think, that's not really problematic from an Islamic perspective. But equality of women also isn't generally a problem, I think, from an Islamic perspective. But there are certain instances in the Quran, for example, where there are certain inequalities that appear to a secular liberal sort of like a reader, for example, or to be inequalities of certain kinds, but they're built into these social sort of matrices that make it perfectly reasonable, for example, for a woman to inherit, for a sister to inherit half of a brother's share, right? In that sort of, even within that matrix, if the father has passed away, the mother, the widow, she's the one who's earning the greatest share, so more than the sons usually. And so, this is only one scenario where brothers and sisters, and part of the reason for that in the Islamic tradition, which, because of, in a sense, we're living in a secular liberal context, we feel this urgency to try and justify our circumstances. And I was having a conversation with my wife earlier saying that, do we really need to justify ourselves? I mean, that's also a question. The only reason we need to do that is because of this barrage of Islamophobia that makes us feel, vulnerable to sort of critique and so on. I was just saying that, look, during the COVID crisis, the number of times Tony Blair, literally a talking war criminal, has been on TV and his opinion asked on a whole host of issues, whereas he is responsible for, as we mentioned, the creation of ISIS. He's responsible for the death of indirect deaths in Iraq. Some people have estimated to be 1 to 2 million people, right? But in any case, I'm digressing a bit. The reality of our situation is we should be perfectly comfortable in our own skins. And I personally think that there are certain aspects of feminism which are perfectly respectable for Muslims to embrace. And there are certain ideological aspects of feminism which are problematic. And we just need to be very sort of discerning and thoughtful about, neither, drinking the Kool-Aid and taking something in hook, line, and sinker, nor, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, right? So inshallah, I hope that answers. Just on the final question that you asked, which is really right up my alley. I would recommend sort of if people forgive the plug of my book, it's coming out in August. If you like to pre-order, you can do that. But I have a book called Islam and the Arab Revolutions, the ulama between democracy and autocracy, and this actually deals with some of the scholars that have kind of been alluded to in the question, where it's saying, some scholars say, let's try, in the interest of maintaining a peaceful environment, try and work alongside the state as much as possible. And others are like, no, we need to be oppositional voices that try, particularly in the Arab world, they're saying we're trying to bring in more freedoms to people and allow their voice to be heard. We want to live in democratic societies rather than these tyrannical authoritarian societies where basically the ruler can imprison whoever they like without any oversight and so on. Great scholars have been imprisoned in recent years. And as a consequence of that, I personally think that a lot of the scholars who basically argue that, we're asking for peace, actually what they're doing, unfortunately, is working for states that are actively engaged in warfare throughout the region and actively engaging in the repression of people well beyond their borders. And these scholars who, very often there's something called the Forum for Promoting Peace in Muslim Societies. And I think this is the question is alluding to something like that. Based in the United Arab Emirates, but it's sort of in partnership with a scholar based in Saudi Arabia. These scholars who are engaged in these sorts of institutions, I think, are unfortunately unwittingly lending their sort of respectability and their religious legitimacy to the perpetration of, very significant violence against other Muslims in the name of peace, ironically enough.
Jazakallah khair, Osama. I think
Yeah.
where you stand on that. So I think I'm going to close on this point. I think we're running well over, but it's been really refreshing to hear your perspective. I think for many of us, we're going to have to review your slides again and check out those book recommendations to fully understand what you were saying. But Jazakallah khair once again for fitting in at last minute.
No problem at all. And
I think we're going to hear from you again, and because you're going to do a reminder on the 17th.
On the 13th. So I will send that as soon as I can. And you know, people can, if anyone has any questions, they can always email me. You can Google me and get my email address from my university website.
Okay, let's close this. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you again from everybody at the Al-Emaan community.